And now I got to figure out how to admit people because there are people waiting to join. Oh, admit all. That was a good one.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Tonight we have our wonderful friend Rochelle Filler from RPI. She's the Assistant Director of Financial Aid. She is kind enough to spend her evening with us. She has a PowerPoint presented to kind of help us navigate financial aid at this point. There'll be more information in January. We will have a second financial aid program in person, weather permitting, on January 4th. So please join us then. And tonight we are happy to take questions. If you wouldn't mind just putting them in the chat, that would be really helpful for us to address your questions. So Rochelle, thank you so much for your time and expertise. If you would like to start, we would be happy to listen.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk about what you need to know now. And I say that because things are changing. Nothing's really been finalized with next year's FAFSA. So we're just going to go through some things now and we'll address some other things later. So we're going to talk about the FSA ID, who needs to have one, when we think the 24-25 FAFSA might be available, some of the changes for anybody who's ever completed a FAFSA before. There are some differences that you will notice. And then we'll talk about the CSS profile, which is currently available. So anybody who's going to be providing information on the FAFSA needs to have their own unique FSA ID. And it has to be created prior to trying to apply using the FAFSA. So since the FAFSA is not yet available, but you can create an FSA ID, I would highly recommend going in, creating an FSA ID if you don't already have one. If you had one for a previous student or you had one for yourself at some point, you'll use the same FSA ID. But if you don't have one already, now is the time to go in and create that so that when the FAFSA becomes available, you'll be good to go and ready to start the FAFSA. You will not be able to begin it without that FSA ID. And all students need to have their own unique FSA ID. So they'll need to have their own email address. I would not recommend using a school email address because this FSA is going to stay with them throughout all their years of applying for federal aid. So ordinarily, the FAFSA would be available right now, but for the 24-25 academic year, it's still in a phase of not yet being complete. So as soon as it is ready, the latest guidance I have is it's supposed to be available in December with an exact date still unknown. But I would definitely keep track of any dates that the colleges your children or students are applying to and see if they have any information, because I can guarantee once the FAFSA becomes available, every college website is going to let you know. So what does the FAFSA do? It collects all kinds of demographic and financial information. The reason it's delayed being available is it is a very different form. It's much shorter than it used to be, asking a lot fewer questions. And they've changed what used to be called the expected family contribution, which was kind of a misnomer. A lot of people thought, oh, if that's what they're telling me I should expect to pay, that's what I'm actually going to have to pay. And that wasn't always the case. So they're changing the formula to produce this Student Aid Index, or SAI. And that's what colleges are going to use to determine any financial need and therefore any need-based financial aid. The FAFSA, as always, is available in both English and Spanish. This is how we're looking at the Student Aid Index. It's really the evaluation of everything you report on the FAFSA. There's a component that comes from the student's information, and a component that comes from the parents' information. And this year, they're eliminating parent one and parent two, and it's just going to be contributors. So that's a little difference that may throw some people off a bit, but keep in mind there's a lot of changes and it's supposed to be easier. That's the whole point. So financial aid offices will determine need using this formula. They'll take the cost of attendance, which includes tuition fees. It's not room and board anymore. It's housing and food, personal and miscellaneous, books and supplies. And then they'll subtract what's calculated as that student aid index. And what you're left with is the financial need. There is a student aid estimator. I went on today just to take a look at it, and where it's down there at the bottom, the studentaid.gov/aid-estimator. You can go there, put in, it doesn't ask every single question on the FAFSA, so it's not a guarantee, and it could change because we'll find out how the data is getting loaded on the new FAFSA, but it would give you a rough estimate of what that student aid index might be. And as you're looking at schools and what their cost of attendance, you can kind of get an idea of what the demonstrated financial need might be. This is what the new FAFSA is going to look like. And when you go to studentaid.gov, you'll see this start a new form for 24-25. It's not there yet, so don't go there just yet trying to find it. Currently, only the 23-24 is available. But this is where you would go to begin the FAFSA. And either the student or the parent can initiate the FAFSA. And I was at a conference last week, and there was actually a rather lively discussion as to whether it's better to start with the student or to start with the parent. I will leave that up to every individual to make that determination. If the student begins the FAFSA, they have to invite their parent to complete information. If the parent begins the FAFSA, when the student signs in, it'll automatically link to the parent's information. So as I said, we're gathering data, or the FAFSA is gathering data from parents if the student is determined to be dependent, and the student, but they're called contributors. And as I said before, every contributor needs to have their own unique FSA ID. The only exception to that is parents who are married and filed jointly. Only one parent is required to have the FSA ID. They can sign the form and give consent for both parents if they're married filing jointly. If they're married filing separately, then each individual filer needs to have their own FSA ID. And you'll see the tax information is going to get imported, and it's just supposed to make the whole process a little bit easier. So the Future Act is what has really driven the change to the FAFSA, because now there's a direct data exchange that is taking place between the FAFSA and the IRS. And to allow individuals information to come over from the IRS, they have to consent. And that's why that FSA ID has to be done ahead of time. It has to be verified so that the IRS can transfer the information, and it will reduce a lot of manual entry and potential mistakes. If a family has not filed a tax return, there is a way to file manually without using the direct data exchange, but if the direct data exchange is available, it's going to happen automatically. So it's pulling in tax return information. It's also going to have to ask some questions about assets and business. So you'll see those. This is, again, a prototype of what the 24-25 FAFSA is going to look like, where contributors will be entering this information about assets and any businesses or other real estate. So the student provides personal information about their parents to invite them. So if the student has begun the FAFSA, they will need to know their parents' social security name, date of birth, social security number, and the email that they want that invitation to go to. That's where I'm thinking it might be easier to have the parent begin the FAFSA, which is, I know that's how most families have completed the FAFSA in years gone by. But if the student begins it, the only way the parent can provide their information is if the student invites them. There will still be the college selection portion. The good news is now 20 schools can be reported on the FAFSA instead of just 10. So this has expanded the number of schools a student can include on the FAFSA to receive the information. And it will, again, the FSA ID is going to be the signature for the student. If the student began it, they're going to email that invitation, and then the parent will use their FSA ID to access that student's FAFSA. So the parent information is their identity and contact information. They're giving consent for that transfer of data from the IRS. They'll need to indicate their marital status, be that married, remarried. So if the biologic parents are divorced or separated and the parent providing information on the FAFSA is remarried, it would be that household, both of those. The other large difference is who is providing information on the FAFSA. It used to be the parent with whom the student lived with most in the last 12 months was the parent of record and would be the person providing information. The new instructions for this year's FAFSA for 24-25 indicate that it should be the parent who has provided the most financial support. Now, how that is determined is left up to the student to decide who has provided the most financial support. But in a situation where one parent makes $40,000 a year and the other parent is providing $80,000 of child support, one can assume it's not the parent that the student lives with, but the other parent who's providing the majority of the financial support. So again, that's a decision that families are going to have to make as to who is providing the most financial support if it's a situation of divorced parents. And the state of legal residence is another question that will be asked for the parents' information. The tax filing status will determine how that FTI is getting transferred from the IRS, and the other assets and any other parent information will be required to be completed on the FAFSA. So once the parent section has been completed, they will sign it and send it off, and then it will get processed and sent to all of the schools listed on the FAFSA. The CSS profile is currently available. So the FAFSA is for federal aid. The CSS profile is used for institutional aid. Not all schools require the CSS profile. If you go to the College Board, which is the entity that has the profile, there is a list of schools that require the profile. I would highly recommend you only complete the profile for schools that require it. There is a fee. It's for anybody whose income is less than $100,000, it's free. But any families whose income is over $100,000, it's $25 for the first school and then $16 for any subsequent schools. So only complete it for the schools that require it. And many schools who require the profile are expecting families to be completing it now, just like they would have been completing the FAFSA now. And although it's used to determine institutional financial aid, schools will get that same SAI calculation from the College Board to be able to estimate the federal aid. So any schools that are looking for that CSS profile, I would say complete it, make sure you hit the deadline. Most of them coincide with the application deadline, so that once a student has been admitted, financial aid award can be provided. And it will include federal aid, but just understand none of that federal aid can actually be dispersed until the FAFSA has been completed. I know I kind of ran through that pretty fast, and it's mostly because a lot of questions and fewer answers when it comes to the FAFSA. Since I have not seen an actual, I've only seen the prototype, and it's not finalized as far as I know right now. But I will certainly open it up to any questions at this point, either from the guidance counselors or any families that are on the call.
So, Rochelle, we have a question about 529 accounts
Yes,
and are reported on the form in addition to the tax return information. Would you know the answer to that?
I do. And
Yay.
actually, this is a change that the 529, you're only reporting what is earmarked for the student applicant. In years gone by, parents had to report the entire 529. If they had 4 kids and each one had 25,000, they had to report that 100,000.
Okay.
The change is that you're only reporting what is earmarked in the 529 as the beneficiary being the student that's on this FAFSA.
Okay, good info. And somebody has a question about how many years of tax information is used.
Good question. So the 24-25 FAFSA is going to be pulling in the 2022 income information. So they call it prior year.
Mhm.
And the reason for that is by this point, everybody should have completed their 2022 federal tax return so that that data can be imported.
Okay. And another question is that with the CSS profile, is it for both parents to complete if divorced or complete one profile per family?
So it's one profile per student. Some schools will ask about the non-custodial parent. So on the profile, the custodial parent is the one reporting in the information. I know Rensselaer requires the profile, but we don't ask about the non-custodial parent. But every school who requires the profile can ask different questions. So you want to make sure you're providing whatever information that particular school is asking for.
So if it's 50-50 shared custody, is there a recommendation of which parent completes it?
Well, with the FAFSA, it's whichever parent provided the most financial support.
Okay.
So I would say use the same parent on the FAFSA and the CSS profile.
Got it. Okay. Another question is there a difference in how colleges are looking at siblings in college when considering aid this year?
Well, that is another good question. So the household size and number in college are being asked on the FAFSA, but the number in college is no longer, are they taking that contribution and dividing the parents by the number in college? So whatever the parent's contribution is, it's going to be the full amount on each FAFSA.
Okay.
That is a big change.
Okay. Can you elaborate on the student ID and parent ID? And I assume when you mean ID, Mr. Sola, you mean the student who and parent who need the FSA ID?
That's correct.
Okay. So we are recording this presentation. So there'll be information on how you can go in and your son to apply for an FSA ID and for you to apply for an FSA ID.
Just know that it's not the quickest process. Because there's such sensitive information that is being used from that FSA ID, you want to set aside a little bit of time before for filling it out and requesting that FSA ID. I know there are 5 different questions that you have to come up with. So for security purposes, but basically you will need your social security number, your date of birth, your name as it appears on your social security card. I know that's been a problem in the past where, students have always gone by Nick, but their first name is really Nicholas on their social security card. So you want to make sure that the name, the date of birth, and the social security number match for that particular FSA ID, and that you're using a unique email address. So I know I have a Filler family email address, but all of my kids had to use their own email addresses when creating their FSA ID, and it absolutely should not be a school email.
Right.
It's something that they will carry with them forever and always.
Okay. Could you speak to if a student does not have a social security number, will they be allowed to create an FSA student account?
No, I should say, if they don't have a social security number, do they have a green card or an alien registration number?
That's in the chat, so maybe we'll wait for this parent to respond.
Yeah, they have the alien registration number. Probably that will work. Yeah,
I
that's the point.
believe that would be the number you would use in creating the FSA ID.
All right.
As long as you're eligible for federal aid, that would be the number.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Okay. A parent had mentioned contribution is considered total income regardless of other financial responsibilities, ?
So what's getting pulled in is that taxable information right from the IRS. And I don't have the formulas to tell you exactly what any offsets are, but it does not take into account any unusual family expenses or obligations. Those would have to go directly to any financial aid office if there's something unusual that you want them to be made aware of.
Okay. And a parent is asking, so if they have 2 students in college at the same time, they are no longer getting a discount for the students. So tuition will be full cost for each student, ?
So it is true that in years past, the parent contribution was divided by the number in college. That is no longer happening. So it doesn't really affect the tuition per se. It more affects what used to be called the EFC, or now is going to be called the Student Aid Index, or the SAI. So correct, it is not dividing it by the number in college.
Okay. But students could still be eligible for aid or merit scholarships or consider searching for private scholarships.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's going to use the same formula for determining need. The cost of attendance minus that student aid index is going to be the demonstrated financial need. And if we look at, different schools have different costs of attendance. The SAI is going to be the same regardless of going to Hudson Valley, SUNY Albany, or Rensselaer.
Mm-hmm.
But that need could change significantly based on the cost of attendance at each of those institutions.
Right. Okay, good. Someone had asked, is there a link that lists the colleges requiring the CSS and deadlines? In the chat, I had added the link to the CSS profile, which is through College Board, as Mrs. Fuller mentioned before. And when I go to this link, I just click on participating colleges.
Yep.
And there's a drop-down menu that shows all the colleges that require the CSS profile.
Correct. And you can even sort by state. So if you don't want to, go through every single college on that list, and, one of the schools is in Georgia and another one is in Michigan, you can just sort on state. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think I've answered all of the questions in the chat.
Rochelle, I have had families who have asked, what happens if my financial situation has changed a lot in the last 2 years? What do I do? Can you
So
address-
each individual financial aid office would need to know that information. There's no way to put it on the FAFSA. Although the profile has a place for some narrative, it's really best to send that information directly to each school that you're applying to explain the situation. All schools who participate in Title IV aid have to allow you the ability to report that information. And what they choose to do with it can vary from one school to the other. Whether it's a loss of a job or, a layoff or any number of other things that can affect, the family's financial situation. But
Mhm.
those would need to be sent directly to the financial aid offices for them to be able to rework that SAI using different information.
Are they better off to make an appointment to talk with someone, or is it enough to email the information?
I would send an email explaining briefly the situation and find out what the best mechanism, because I wouldn't want families emailing tax returns. It's not secure. But most schools will have some kind of way to upload securely that information. And if you email the financial aid office and say, our income has changed significantly since 2022. How do I report that? They can give you the best information on how you can send that secure information.
Great. And I had another question that had come up in my senior meetings about, I have a few families who weren't required to file tax returns. And I did hear you mention that there is a way to complete the FAFSA even if you weren't required to complete a tax return. Can you talk just a little bit more about that, whatever you might know at this point?
So what I have been told is if person was not required to file a tax return, it will still go out to the IRS, and what will come back is a statement of non-filing.
Oh,
So
great.
it'll be a verification that it wasn't just that they didn't file a tax return, but they were not required to file a tax return. If it's a situation where a parent lives overseas and is not a US citizen and not completing a federal tax return, that is going to require that family to submit the information via a PDF paper application, and it will take significantly more time.
Okay. Couple more questions.
Mhm.
A parent is asking for the CSS profile. There's a question about parents' employment source, work for others or self-employed. Is he correct in thinking that a professional who owns a business and is a W-2 employee of that business is not self-employed, which seems more like a 1099 situation?
I would think if they own the business, they would be considered self-employed.
Okay. Another parent mentions if the information for FAFSA is based on 2022 taxes, and one parent was laid off but now working and making more than the other parent, is that parent considered the one contributing more?
Assuming this is a divorce situation, in which case whoever that family determines is providing the most financial support would be the contributor to the FAFSA.
Okay.
I'm not trying to be vague or evasive. But I haven't seen the language on the FAFSA, but
Right.
what, everything we've been told is what it's going to ask in determining. Now, if families are, even if parents are divorced, but they still live in the same household, they both have to report information.
Oh, okay. Good information. Okay. I believe that is all the questions that have come into the chat.
There's one more,
Okay.
which I think I might be able to answer.
Okay.
For the FSA ID, can parents use the same email address across different children? Realize each child needs their own email address. I believe since parents get a single FSA ID, that's their email address. They only need it once. Is that correct, Rochelle?
You are 100% correct. The parent owns that FSA ID and they will use it for every child's FAFSA. And if they were to file their own FAFSA, it would be their FSA ID. So yes, each parent would have their own unique FSA ID. If both parents are creating FSA IDs, they have to use different email addresses. So again, like if you have a family email address, only one parent would be able to use that. The other parent would have to create or use a different email address.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Knapp. That just popped up for me. Okay. All right. Does anybody have any other questions?
So if you find that you do have questions, hold on to them until January. We will be doing another program, hopefully in person, weather permitting. And when we actually have the FAFSA and can look at, everybody can have taken a look at it and see what's actually there.
Correct. Yeah. The whole point of the new FAFSA is it's supposed to be a simplification for families. And I wanted to keep this kind of brief so that we weren't getting too deep into the weeds and things that may change by December. Once we have the complete FAFSA and it's good and ready to go, we'll come back and do a more detailed how you walk through the FAFSA kind of presentation.
Great.
But by all means, any schools who require the profile, get those done now whenever they're expected to be completed. And you may want to check with schools that don't require the profile to find out if they have any institutional applications that they're asking to be completed while we wait for the FAFSA, especially for the early action, early decision population.
Very good advice.
Rochelle, do you have a recommendation if people run into trouble completing the CSS profile, what they should do? Like if they get stuck and can't figure out how to answer specific questions?
I know that there's a help function on the profile. I would use that first. If for some reason you're not getting the answer you needed, then I would go to that, whichever school is requiring the profile. As I said, different schools can have different questions on the profile. So no two profiles are exactly the same. So if you're applying to Rensselaer and also Vassar, which would be unlikely, but it's just two schools in New York that both require the profile. Vassar may ask questions that Rensselaer does not. So it might be hard for the school to instruct you on how to answer questions if it wasn't a question their school was requiring.
Okay. And to confirm, we know the FAFSA is going to be released in December, but we don't have an exact date.
We don't. I was at the New York State Financial Aid Administrators Association conference last week, and every table I sat at, everybody was taking bets on, will it be December 31st? And, are they going to push it into January? The statute says it has to be December, but as we all know, statutes can be changed. So I'm hopeful that it will be December, but I would not be shocked if it was early January.
Got it.
A big push and a lot of rumblings will happen if it's not out in December.
I'm sure. Oh my goodness. Well, we know it's a very busy time at Rensselaer. We are really grateful for your expertise. You're always so kind and informative, and we are very grateful for your time and expertise as always. So thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you all in person in January, weather permitting, of course. And thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. And yes, I will come back and tell you what I know when I know it.
We appreciate you. Thank you so much.
You are very welcome. You have a good evening.
All right.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone. Have a great night, everyone.